He had the face, the fame, and the fortune. Don Johnson wasn't just another TV actor. He was the icon of an entire generation. In the 1980s, you didn't need to say his full name. Just Don was enough. The pastel suits, the Ferrari, the effortless cool. He made Miami Vice more than a show. He made it a cultural phenomenon. Teenagers wanted to be him. Women wanted to be with him. And men? They copied everything, from his 5 o'clock shadow to his sockless loafers. But fame like that doesn't last forever. And for Don, it didn't just fade. It imploded. Because behind the glamorous red carpets and the designer sunglasses, there was a storm quietly brewing. A storm filled with addiction, broken relationships, shady business deals, and financial disasters that not even a Hollywood script could invent. One minute he was raking in $150,000 per episode, and the next he was begging banks not to seize his home. So how did it happen? How did a Missouri boy from a broken home climb to the top of Hollywood, only to find himself drowning in debt, addiction, and rumors that he was involved in international laundering? And now that he's 75, what's left of the Don Johnson empire? The cash? Vanished. The reputation? Hanging by a thread. But beneath the ashes of all that chaos, there's a man who's still standing. Scarred, older, but far from finished. Because for Don Johnson, the fall was just the beginning. And what he went through after losing it all will leave you speechless. The peak of fame. In the 1980s, Don Johnson wasn't just a TV star. He was the symbol of everything America worshipped. Wealth, style, danger, and raw charisma. When Miami Vice hit the airwaves in 1984, it didn't just launch a show, it launched a movement. And at the center of it all was Johnson, playing Detective Sonny Crockett like he was born for it. Sleek white suits, tanned skin, a speedboat, and a pet alligator named Elvis. He wasn't acting. He was the fantasy. Almost overnight, he became the face of primetime television. With each passing week, the ratings soared, and so did his paycheck. By the late 80s, Don Johnson was pulling in over $100,000 per episode, a staggering sum at the time. But that was just TV money. He had other streams rolling in too. Don took that small-screen stardom and flipped it into music success. In 1986, he released his debut pop-rock album Heartbeat. And to everyone's surprise, it wasn't a vanity project. The title track cracked the Billboard Hot 100 and landed him on stages packed with screaming fans. For a while, Don Johnson was a certified rock star. He sang duets with Barbra Streisand. He performed live. He partied harder than anyone in the business, and no one dared to question it. Off-screen, his life was even more extravagant. He owned properties across the country, a waterfront estate in Miami, a Hollywood Hills mansion, and a sprawling 17-acre ranch in Aspen that looked like it belonged to royalty. His garage was a dream lineup. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Porsches, Rolls-Royces, the kind of collection that made billionaires jealous. And then there were the people. Don didn't just rub shoulders with the rich and famous. He owned the room. He partied with Jack Nicholson, sipped champagne with Barbra Streisand, and had a front-row seat to every elite circle in Hollywood. Even Leonardo DiCaprio was in the picture, quite literally. Years later, Leo would go on to date Don's daughter, Dakota Johnson, proving just how long Don's influence lasted. His face was everywhere. Billboards, magazine covers, late-night shows. People magazine even named him sexiest man alive. And for good reason. He had the looks, the charm, and a devil-may-care confidence that no one could fake. For a while, it seemed like nothing could touch him. But as the homes got bigger and the parties got wilder, something else was brewing. He wasn't just living large. He was spending like the good times would never end. The yachts, the designer suits, the $10,000 dinners, it all came with a cost. And somewhere beneath the glitz, the cracks had already started forming. He just didn't see them yet. Humble beginnings. Before the Ferraris, the fame, or the pastel suits, Don Johnson was just a poor kid from Flat Creek, Missouri, a place most people couldn't even find on a map. He wasn't born into money, privilege, or connections. He was born into struggle. His mother was only 16 years old when she gave birth to him. His father? Just 19. Two teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, suddenly responsible for raising a family in rural America. There was no Hollywood dream, no safety net, and no roadmap for success. Just a lot of long days, tight budgets, and unspoken tension. By the time Don was still in grade school, the family packed up and moved to Wichita, Kansas, hoping for a better shot at life. But things didn't get easier. In fact, they only got more chaotic. Money was always tight. His parents' marriage strained under the pressure, eventually ending in divorce when Don was just 12 years old. That divorce changed everything. His home life shattered. He suddenly became the oldest man in the house, with no real direction, and no one showing him the way. He would later describe his childhood as chaotic, emotionally vacant, and full of confusion. In his own words, "I had the quinella, maltreatment, and parents who were kids themselves. I was the oldest, and I was completely lost." By 16, he'd had enough. He left home, not in a blaze of glory, but in quiet desperation. No money, no real plan, just raw ambition and a refusal to let his environment define him. But for all the trauma, something was forming deep inside Don. A fire. A refusal to accept a life of mediocrity. He didn't know how he'd make it out, but he knew he would. And that certainty, that stubborn spark, would become his most valuable weapon. In high school, a twist of fate sent him down the path to stardom. Needing extra credits just to graduate, he enrolled in a drama class. Not because he dreamed of acting, but because he had no other choice. But something happened on that stage. The moment he stepped into the spotlight, everything changed. The audience clapped. The lights hit. And for the first time in his life, Don Johnson felt seen. He played Tony in West Side Story, and that performance didn't just win over the room. It lit a fire that would burn for decades. As Don later said, "The stage was like a drug. I was finally getting the kind of love and attention I never got at home." After graduating, he enrolled at the University of Kansas with a partial scholarship, majoring in drama. But the hunger for something bigger pulled at him constantly. Eventually, he left Kansas behind and headed for the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, the same place that trained legends. It was there that Don Johnson began to evolve, not just as an actor, but as a person. He was still rough around the edges, still carrying the baggage of his past, but he was determined to make something of himself. Every audition was a battle, every rejection fuel, and even when the doors slammed shut, he kept pushing. He didn't have family in the business. He didn't have money to fall back on. All he had was a little talent and a lot of grit. And slowly, the kid from Kansas began clawing his way toward something no one thought was possible. Road to stardom. Hollywood doesn't make room for outsiders, especially not scrappy, stubborn kids from Kansas with no name, no agent, and no trust fund. But Don Johnson didn't care. He wasn't looking for an invitation. He kicked the doors open himself. After leaving Kansas and honing his skills at the American Conservatory Theater, Don started taking whatever roles he could get. No part too small, no paycheck too humble. In the late 60s and early 70s, he was just one of thousands of struggling actors trying to survive in a city built on dreams and rejection. Most people never noticed him. But those who did saw something different, a presence, an edge, a kind of dangerous charm you couldn't teach. One of his first breakout moments came in 1975 with a bizarre and boundary-pushing indie film called A Boy and His Dog. It was dark, it was gritty, and it was weird enough to turn heads. The movie didn't make him a household name, but it did earn him cult status, especially among critics who suddenly started paying attention to the shaggy-haired young actor with the slow, confident drawl. But cult fame doesn't pay the bills. And for years, Don was stuck in the purgatory of almost. Almost famous, almost successful, almost breaking through. He bounced between low-budget films and forgettable TV guest spots, always circling the spotlight but never stepping into it. Behind the scenes, the struggle was relentless. Casting agents told him he was too edgy. Producers said he wasn't leading man material. One network executive even told him to shave his mustache, smile more, and try to be less intense. But Don wasn't built for compromise. He refused to soften up or play the game. And that stubbornness cost him. Role after role slipped through his fingers. Years passed, and as he approached his mid-30s, many in the industry quietly wrote him off. Another talented guy who never quite made it. Then, in 1984, everything changed. NBC greenlit a new crime drama, a flashy, fast-paced show about undercover cops in Miami. At first, nobody had high hopes. The pitch sounded ridiculous. Cops in linen suits, synth-pop soundtracks, a pet alligator. It sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. But then they cast Don Johnson as Detective Sonny Crockett, and that changed everything. The first time the pilot aired, it didn't just get good reviews. It exploded. Audiences were hypnotized. The neon lights, the moody shots, the music, and most of all, him. Don Johnson didn't just play Sonny Crockett. He became the very definition of cool. His tired eyes, his low voice, his unshakable confidence. It was like the world finally caught up to what Don had always known. He wasn't just another actor. He was a star. Miami Vice became a phenomenon. Within months, Don Johnson was on every magazine cover in America. Teenagers copied his fashion. Designers begged him to wear their brands. He was no longer auditioning for parts. He was turning down million-dollar offers. And the most ironic part? He almost didn't get the role. Producers were hesitant. Network execs thought he was too intense. But the show's creator, Michael Mann, saw the truth. That Don's past wasn't a liability. It was fuel. That pain, that edge, that emotional baggage, it was exactly what made Sonny Crockett believable. And just like that, the years of grinding, rejection, and near failures paid off in full. Don Johnson had finally made it. But while the cameras rolled and the money poured in, the story behind the scenes was far more complicated. Because fame, as Don would soon learn, doesn't just lift you up, it also puts you on a pedestal just high enough to fall from. And the fall was already beginning. Relationships and family. Don Johnson didn't just make headlines for his acting. He made them for the chaos behind the curtain. If his professional life was a Hollywood roller coaster, his love life was a full-blown soap opera. Passion, fame, heartbreak. On repeat. He wasn't just dating casually. He was headlining every tabloid in America with a rotation of high-profile romances that read like a casting list for the Oscars. Some called him a romantic, others called him reckless. But one thing was clear. Don Johnson didn't do boring. By the time he was in his 30s, he had already been married more times than most people even dare to dream of. In total, he's tied the knot 5 times, to 4 different women. 2 of those marriages were so brief, they were practically erased from the public record. One ended in days, the other just as fast. Don's only public comment? One was a dancer, and the other, in his words, a rich bimbo. That's the kind of raw, unfiltered truth only Don would say out loud. But the relationship that truly defined his early years, and much of his emotional life, was the one with Melanie Griffith. They met in 1973 on the set of The Herod Experiment. She was just 14, He was 22. Controversial? Absolutely. But their chemistry was undeniable. By the time she turned 18, they were engaged. In 1976, they got married. 7 months later, they were divorced. It was a whirlwind, messy, passionate, and completely unstable. But their story wasn't over. Not even close. More than a decade later, after everything they'd been through, the fame, the failures, the chaos, they found their way back to each other. In 1989, they remarried. This time, it wasn't just tabloid fuel. It was something bigger. That year, they welcomed a daughter, Dakota Johnson. And for a moment, it seemed like the chaos might finally settle into something real. But love isn't always enough. By 1996, Dawn and Melanie were finished, again. This time for good. Melanie later said, "He's no angel. He's not easy. It's hard for me to imagine life without him. But we're changing in different ways." And Dawn? His response was classic Dawn Johnson, raw and poetic. "Some people are just meant to be together, and I think that was true for Melanie and me. I don't believe love dies. It changes. It becomes something else. Despite everything, the breakups, the divorces, the heartbreak, they stayed close. They co-parented Dakota with Grace. They showed up at each other's events. They cheered their daughter on together as she rose to stardom. Somehow, through all the wreckage, they salvaged something meaningful. But Melanie wasn't the only woman in Dawn's world. He dated Barbra Streisand. Yes, that Barbra Streisand. For a moment in the late 80s, they were the ultimate power couple. Glamorous, bold, and totally unexpected. They shared stages, red carpets, and intense public fascination. But like most of Dawn's flings, it didn't last. Then there was Patty D'Arbanville, a model, actress, and long-term partner. They lived together for years in the early 80s. They never married, but they had a son, Jesse Johnson, who would also go on to act. Dawn was present in his life, but the relationship, like so many others, eventually burned out. Rumors also linked Dawn to Uma Thurman in the early 90s. It was brief. It was controversial. The age gap raised eyebrows everywhere. And it didn't last long. But nothing stirred up more gossip than his relationship with Jodi Lyn O'Keefe. They met while filming Nash Bridges. She played his on-screen daughter. He was in his late 40s. She was barely 18. When the news broke that they were dating in real life, the media lost its mind. It was all over the tabloids. Critics called it inappropriate. But Dawn didn't care. For years, they stayed together, defying every headline and every whisper. That was Dawn Johnson. He didn't play by the rules, especially not when it came to love. But then, just when no one expected it, he did something completely out of character. He settled down. In 1999, Dawn married Kelly Phleger, a San Francisco socialite and former preschool teacher. She wasn't from Hollywood. She wasn't chasing fame. She didn't care about red carpets. And maybe that's why it worked. She was 27. Dawn was 49. And yet, it clicked. They've been together ever since. More than 2 decades of marriage, 3 children, and not a single scandal between them. For a man who once collected breakups like trophies, this was a new chapter entirely. And Dawn knew it. He credited Kelly with saving him, from the chaos, from the fame, and from himself. She was the calm after the storm. And for the first time in his life, Dawn Johnson found something he'd never truly had before: peace. But before he reached that quiet place, before he found stability, he had to crash. Hard. Because while the public was fixated on his love life, something much darker was unfolding behind the scenes. And it was about to take everything from him. Addiction and wild lifestyle. Fame doesn't just give, it takes. And in Don Johnson's case, it almost took everything. Behind the linen suits, the Ferraris, and the magazine covers, Don was unraveling. Slowly, quietly, and then, all at once. At the peak of Miami Vice, Don Johnson was one of the most recognizable men on the planet. He wasn't just playing a role, he had become the face of 80s cool. But what most people didn't see was the price he was paying to keep that image alive. The long hours, the crushing expectations, the constant eyes, the unrelenting pressure to always be Don Johnson. And somewhere along the way, the high from the spotlight stopped being enough. So he found other highs. At first it was just partying, the kind of wild, over-the-top Hollywood nights that most people only read about. But in the 1980s, partying didn't mean casual drinks and loud music. It meant substances, dangerous ones, and they were everywhere. Don once said, "When I was a young man in Hollywood, those things were everywhere. They didn't seem like a big deal. Everyone was doing it. But it creeps up on you. And before you know it, you're not in control anymore." The lines between partying and coping blurred fast. At first, the alcohol dulled the stress. The other stuff gave him energy, confidence, a false sense of control. But it didn't last. It never does. Soon, the cracks started to show. He was still showing up on set, still smiling for cameras, but inside, he was spiraling. Friends noticed mood swings. Producers whispered about erratic behavior. And in one now infamous incident, Don called into a live morning radio show completely slurred and unfiltered, hurling insults at the hosts on air. It wasn't just a bad look. It was a cry for help. Eventually, he couldn't hide it anymore. The late nights turned into missed opportunities. The pressure became unbearable. The substances were no longer optional. They were required just to get through the day. He wasn't partying anymore. He was escaping. And finally, he hit the wall. Don quietly entered rehab. No press release, no photos, just silence. A man who once had the world at his feet now had to fight just to face his reflection in the mirror. The road to recovery was long, painful, and private, but it was real. Later, he admitted, "The drinking had taken over. I wasn't myself. I was afraid I was going to lose my family, my career, maybe even my life." It was the first time Don dropped the act. And while rehab helped him regain control, it didn't fix everything. The damage was done. Years of reckless decisions, financial neglect, broken relationships, they were all waiting for him when he got out. Because addiction isn't just about the substance, it's about the wake it leaves behind. And Don's wake was massive. The money was already slipping through his fingers. The acting roles were slowing down. The phone didn't ring as often. Studios hesitated. Insurance companies raised red flags. And suddenly, the man who once couldn't escape the spotlight was being quietly pushed out of it. But the worst was yet to come. Because addiction didn't just wreck his health, it left him vulnerable. Vulnerable to bad deals, shady characters, and one of the most bizarre, almost unbelievable scandals in his entire career. An incident so strange, so dramatic, and so massive in scale that it would dominate headlines across Europe and nearly destroy him all over again. The $8 billion scandal. By the early 2000s, Don Johnson was no longer the fresh-faced heartthrob in white linen. The pastel glow of Miami Vice had faded. The industry had moved on. But Don? He wasn't ready to let go of the high life. He was still flying private, still wearing designer, still playing the part of a man who had it all, even though behind the curtain, the debts were mounting, and the cracks were widening. And then came the moment that stopped everything. November 2002. Don Johnson was traveling through Europe, business as usual. He landed at the German-Swiss border in a sleek, black Mercedes, headed into Germany with a group of associates. It should have been routine. Just another crossing for a once glamorous star clinging to his image. But customs officials had other plans. They searched the car. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, at first. Then they opened Don's briefcase, and what they found was absolutely insane. Documents, thick stacks of financial records, papers linked to bank accounts worth, wait for it, over $8 billion. That's not a typo. $8 billion. These weren't checks or receipts. These were high-level financial documents tied to investment transfers, offshore banking activity, and shadowy global accounts. The kind of paperwork that sets off every alarm bell in international finance. The German officers were stunned. They detained Don Johnson on the spot and launched an official investigation into possible money laundering. And suddenly, the once golden boy of American television was now at the center of an international financial scandal. A spokesperson for the German Customs Department told the press, "There is reasonable suspicion that Mr. Johnson was working for others. If everything is legal, you don't carry documents worth $8 billion into Germany in a car." The world exploded. Headlines screamed, "Don Johnson investigated for international fraud." $8 billion mystery. Is Don Johnson in deep? Miami Vice star linked to global financial network. Tabloids had a field day. Social media, still in its early stages, lit up. For fans who remembered him as the untouchable icon of cool, it was surreal. Was this real? Was Don actually involved in some underground banking conspiracy? Even Hollywood insiders didn't know what to think. Was he duped? Desperate? Guilty? Don, of course, denied everything. He claimed the documents weren't his, that he was simply traveling with business associates and had no idea what was inside the briefcase. According to him, it was all part of a film financing deal, totally above board. And after weeks of investigation, the German authorities agreed. They found no evidence of criminal activity. Don was cleared of all charges, no arrest, no fines, no convictions, just a big question mark that still hasn't gone away. But here's the thing. The damage was already done. Because in Hollywood, where image is everything, you don't bounce back from headlines like that, even if you're innocent. People whispered, why was he even in that situation? Was he desperate? Was he being used? And suddenly, Don Johnson wasn't just the guy who partied too hard or burned through his fortune. Now, he was the guy with $8 billion in mystery documents and no good explanation for them. Reputation? Shattered? Trust? Gone. Studios, already hesitant after his rehab stint, now considered him radioactive. Deals were pulled. Calls stopped. The industry turned its back. And all the while, the bills kept coming. The lifestyle hadn't slowed down. But the money had. And for the first time in decades, Don Johnson was teetering on the edge of something no one expected. Financial collapse. And the worst part? It was only just beginning. Financial ruin. When the $8 billion scandal faded from the headlines, Don Johnson was still standing, but barely. His name had been cleared, but his reputation? Ruined. The phones weren't ringing, the scripts weren't coming, and behind closed doors, the bills were piling up like a house of cards. And soon, that house of cards would come crashing down. You see, Don didn't just spend like a star. He spent like the money would never stop. Even when the rolls slowed down, even when the royalty checks dried up, he kept living like it was still 1986. The Aspen Mansion, the Miami compound, the ranch in Colorado, the designer suits, the sports cars, the dinners with 5-digit tabs. It never stopped. But the income? That did. And with every month that passed, Don Johnson was slipping deeper into the one place no celebrity ever wants to go. Debt. But then, in true Don Johnson fashion, something mysterious happened. At the very last moment, a payment was made. Just enough to stop the foreclosure. No one knew where the money came from. Not the bank, not the public, not even his team. Some said it was a shadow investor. Others claimed he borrowed it from wealthy friends. A few insiders whispered that Don quietly sold off personal items, rare cars, art, jewelry, just to save the house. Whatever it was, it worked. Barely. But the headlines didn't care about the details. All they saw was another dramatic fall from grace. Don Johnson nearly loses Aspen home in foreclosure. Miami Vice star drowning in debt. How did it all go so wrong? And the truth? It had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. This wasn't just one bad investment or one bad year. This was years of unchecked spending, poor financial planning, and blind trust in the wrong people. Don had built a kingdom on image. But when the image faded, there was no foundation underneath. His net worth plummeted. His name no longer carried weight. And worse, he was still fighting. In 2008, he filed a lawsuit against Reicher Entertainment, the production company behind Nash Bridges. Don claimed they had cheated him out of millions in unpaid profits from the show's syndication. He didn't just want compensation, he needed it. He sued for $23 million. It was a brutal legal battle, drawn out, messy, and fueled by desperation. But in the end, Don won. A jury awarded him $23.2 million. It was a rare victory, a lifeline. But even that didn't erase the damage. Because by then, Don Johnson wasn't remembered as the man who brought Sonny Crockett to life. He was remembered as the man who went from sex symbol to financial wreck. He had burned through decades of success. And now he was scraping the bottom. The mansions were still there, but barely. The fame was still there, but hollow. And the money? It vanished faster than it ever came. This was the moment where most celebrities disappear. Quietly, shamefully, forever. But Don Johnson didn't vanish. Not yet. Because somehow, after everything, the addiction, the scandals, the lawsuits, the millions lost, he found one last card to play. A comeback. The comeback and life at 75. Most people would have disappeared. After the scandal, the rehab, the foreclosure, the lawsuits, after losing millions and the world's respect, most stars would have quietly retired, tucked their tail, and faded into tabloid history. But Don Johnson? He wasn't most people. Because somehow, after it all, Don didn't just survive. He came back. No, he didn't return as the leading man in white suits with a Ferrari and a pet alligator. That Don was gone. And maybe that was a good thing. What came back was something else entirely. A wiser, sharper, emotionally weathered version of the man who once ruled TV. Gone was the flash. In its place was substance. Yes. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Don started reappearing in places no one expected. He made fun of himself in Eastbound and Down, playing a broken, over-the-top version of his former self. And audiences loved it. He wasn't afraid to be the punchline. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. That move changed everything. Suddenly, Hollywood started seeing him differently, not as a washed-up playboy clinging to old glories, but as a seasoned pro with stories in his eyes. A man who had lived, stumbled, and learned. Directors wanted him for roles that required grit, pain, experience, all the things Don had in spades. Then came a string of appearances. In Brawl, in Cell Block, 99, Watchmen, and the film that truly revived him, Knives Out. In that movie, Don held his own alongside a star-studded cast of younger, hotter actors, and he stole scenes. Fans and critics were stunned. Suddenly, Don Johnson was relevant again. And in 2024, at the age of 74, he appeared in Netflix's action thriller Rebel Ridge. For an entire generation who had no idea who Sonny Crockett was, Don Johnson became the cool older guy with the slow burn and killer delivery. He had officially entered his second act. But what made this comeback different was the man behind it. Because Don wasn't trying to be anyone else anymore. He wasn't chasing image or clout. He wasn't pretending to be 35. He was 75, sober, grounded, and finally at peace with everything that came before. He now speaks openly about his past, the addiction, the losses, the mistakes. There's no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance, regret, maybe, but also pride. Because Don Johnson knows what he survived. He didn't die a Hollywood cliché. He didn't disappear under a pile of debts and broken marriages. He endured. He's still married to Kelly, over 2 decades and counting. He still spends time with Dakota and Jesse. He's still showing up for interviews, movie sets, red carpets. On his terms now. And financially? He may never have the empire he once blew through, but he's no longer at risk of losing everything either. The lawsuits are over. The debts are managed. He's not rich the way he once was, but he's stable. And for a man who once nearly lost it all, that's a victory. Because here's the truth. Don Johnson didn't just have a comeback. He had a reckoning. He faced the darkest parts of himself, and he came out the other side, older, scarred, and realer than ever. And that might be cooler than Sonny Crockett ever was. Conclusion. Don Johnson's story isn't just about fame. It's about what happens after. After the lights fade. After the money disappears. After the mistakes catch up. After the world stops cheering and starts whispering. He had it all. The success, the women, the cars, the power. And he lost it, spectacularly. To addiction, to bad decisions, to pride, to the kind of reckless living that eventually comes for everyone. But the difference? Don Johnson didn't stay down. He didn't vanish into some sad, forgotten corner of Hollywood. He didn't become a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. He kept going, limping at times, bruised, mocked, written off, but still standing. At 75, Don Johnson isn't trying to be the man he was. He's become someone far more interesting, a survivor, a father, a husband, a man who's seen every side of fame and lived to tell the story. But here's the real question. Did he truly learn from it all? Or is there still another fall waiting in the wings? Let us know what you think. Is Don Johnson finally at peace? Or is there more drama still to unfold? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're watching them all. And if you love deep, raw dives into the lives of celebrities beyond the headlines, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on that bell so you never miss a story that Hollywood would rather forget.